The Rwandan genocide, which took place from April to June 1994, was the most efficient genocide ever carried out, with over 800,000 slaughtered in just 100 days. This is due to a large number of casualties being carried out by the ethnic majority of Hutu civilians. The first ethical dilemma we encounter in this situation is one we frequently see mirrored alongside World War II. What responsibility do the Germans, or in this situation Hutu civilians, have in the genocide, and do they need to be held accountable? This question is quite contentious in the context of World War II because the majority of German civilians did not carry out violent crimes towards the Jewish people, yet at minimum they were complicit. This conundrum in the context of the Rwandan genocide may seem less complicated at first glance, but in reality, the pre-existing conditions and salience of propaganda call into question the level of individual autonomy we immediately assume. The ethic of care is a tradition in feminist ethics created by Carol Gillian, which distinguishes itself from more masculine ethics of justice. The theory states that men tend to make judgments based on procedure and universal principles, whereas women make contextual judgments. Built on the idea of maternal thinking, the ethic of care recognizes the responsibility of the moral agent and the needs of others. It also is sensitive to the context of ethical dilemmas and appreciates the perspectives of everyone involved. Applying the ethic of care to international politics requires us not only to care for the needs of others, but also understands that ethical principles vary across cultures. Ethics scholar Fiona Robinson's critique of maternal thinking critical care instead identifies care as an everyday practice and moral orientation embedded in actual contexts. Critical care rejects the communitarian notion that a practice ought to be respected because it's embedded in a culture, and instead argues that we can respect the practitioner, but we don't need to respect the practice itself. Critical care recognizes the context of practices we might deem immoral or unethical, female circumcision being a frequent example, but does not accept this practice on this basis alone. In applying these principles to the Rwandan genocide, I seek to understand the context that led civilians to participate in the first place. The goal is to recognize the role that prior attitudes, access to information, and reliability of information sources that led some Hutu civilians to be more susceptible to government propaganda. Pre-existing ethnic tensions already existed between the Hutu and the Tutsi, a civil war raging in northern Rwanda from 1990 through the genocide. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, a group made up of exiled Tutsi, was utilizing guerrilla warfare tactics in this region. This context is significant when we examine the role of the Hutu government's hate radio station, RTLM. This radio station argued that the extermination of Tutsi was necessary self-defense to prevent them from overthrowing the nation. The RTLM weaponized pre-existing sentiments about Tutsi, claiming their slaughter was noble work. The government's involvement in this hate radio station was not subtle. The Prime Minister even called into the show, declaring it a key weapon in the war against the Tutsi. Understanding how influential this radio station was is just the half of it. In fact, RTLM radio transmitters were seemingly placed deliberately in the northern region where anti-Tutsi sentiment would be the most salient. Further, these radio transmitters were also proximate to communities with a higher Hutu population. The data necessary to truly analyze how many and what demographics of people were listening to this station is unavailable. But we can examine a number of other factors that will paint a picture of how powerful this radio station was. We can examine by village the number of genocide-related criminal cases against civilians, as well as village literacy rates, ethnic demographics, and wealth. Newspapers were the primary medium for non-government groups, whereas the government's primary method was this RTLM radio station. This meant that nearly half the population who was not literate only had access to information presented by the government. The effects of radio access were minimal to none in villages with high literacy rates. Without the proper education, people would be more susceptible to persuasive power, and they would not have access to alternative sources of information. When we take this into consideration, the ethic of care reminds us that humans are multifaceted and subject to influence. While we don't need to respect the actions of civilians, we still ought to respect the civilians themselves and the context which brought this behavior out. How does propaganda interfere with ethical foreign policy and outcomes? In 2014, BBC came out with its own documentary on the genocide, which presented an alternate narrative. On the whole, the BBC made a critique of Kagame's regime and flipped the accepted narrative on its head. When faced with claims of genocide denial, BBC responded saying it was their journalistic duty to present both sides of the story. While the documentary doesn't quite reach the territory of genocide denial, it certainly qualifies as genocide revisionism. Controversy ensued after the release of this documentary, once again sparking a flame of discourse on a genocide which had yet to entirely subside. This documentary reminds us that two conflicting stories are not too uncommon after a genocide. History is built on narratives, but real life is not. The only people who can truly understand what happened are those who lived through it, and the information is spread from there. That's not to say that documenting history is a lost cause, but rather it's a reminder that the truth is not set in stone. Interpretations of the past are subject to change in response to new evidence, new questions asked of the evidence, new perspectives gained by the passage of time. There is no single, eternal, and immutable truth about past events and their meaning. This documentary demonstrates the power of media in shaping our understanding of the world around us. Whether or not everyone agrees, this documentary does qualify as propaganda. Propaganda, in the most neutral sense, means to disseminate or promote particular ideas. Propaganda does not have to include misinformation, and it does not have to have foul intentions. The BBC documentary is an example of attempts by Western news outlets to retell the history of the global South in a way that can frequently cause more harm than good. Perhaps it's the colonial instinct to impose ourselves in situations we shouldn't, or to do so in a way which is disingenuous to the wishes of those it actually affects. Kagame, in response to the documentary, urged his citizens to own their stories and to shape them however they wish, because they are their stories and theirs alone. He also commented on the inherently colonial nature of the BBC's imposition, and this is done simply because we are Rwandans and Africans. I'm sure BBC cannot produce a similar documentary referring to what happened in Bosnia, for example. I cannot dare doing the same with the Holocaust, but since it's about Rwanda and Africa, they do it. That's what they did to us this time. The lesson we can learn from this is simple. When we attempt to retell someone else's story for them, we're doing a disservice to the victims and to what we understand as the truth. It's not the place of Western journalists to repackage a genocide in a way that's more digestible or sensational for Western audiences. Going back once again to the ethic of care, we as an audience have a responsibility to respect the humanity and the experiences of those we might not understand. We also have a responsibility to think twice about the information we're being presented with. Context is important, and empathy for those contexts is even more important. White and Western audiences have a tendency to believe that their values are the only ones that exist, or are the only correct set of values. But this couldn't be further from the truth. There is no universal code of ethics because no ethics are universal. The power of media and storytelling in shaping our understanding of the world is paramount. Propaganda is not only a tool to sway people's beliefs, mobilize them to violence, and to rewrite history, but it's also a very effective tool of foreign policy. When we use propaganda as a tool for influence, someone will inevitably be caught in the crosshairs. Even if the BBC had the purest of intentions, those whose stories were discounted in the documentary suffered as a result. Today, media spreads farther and faster than any weapon ever could. Though it may not cause bodily harm, the information, or potentially false information it wields, shapes our attitudes, our elections, our government, our foreign policy, and the outcomes of our foreign policy. Information is power, and propaganda takes advantage of this power in a way that reverberates around the world and years into the future.